The moment we walked into the exhibition hall, I could tell something was off. It wasn't just the gleaming furniture displays or the hum of voices discussing the latest design trends. No, it was the way Anabel was acting, excited, nervous even, in a way I hadn't seen in years. We'd been to a dozen events like this before, but this time, she seemed different. Her eyes darted around, and she had that smile on her face, the kind that you don't just wear for casual networking. I watched as her gaze settled on one man across the room. Tall, well-dressed, with that air of someone who commands attention effortlessly. I didn't recognize him at first, but the way everyone in the room seemed to gravitate toward him made it clear. He was somebody important. "That's Clark Reed," Anabel whispered, a little too eagerly. "You know, the architect I was telling you about?" Of course, I'd heard about him. A rising star in the design world, featured in every major magazine. But I didn't expect the way she was looking at him, like he was some sort of idol. It made my stomach turn. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just admiration. After all, Anabel was passionate about her career, and Clark was a big name in the industry. Still, the way her eyes lit up when Clark approached us for small talk was enough to make me grit my teeth. "Anabel, right? I've heard a lot about your work," Clark said, his tone smooth, almost too polished. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you." Anabel blushed. Actually blushed. She wasn't the type to get flustered easily. But here she was, standing next to me, giggling like a schoolgirl. "The pleasure's mine," she replied, her voice softer than usual. "I've admired your projects for a long time. It's really inspiring to see how you blend modern design with functionality." I could barely get a word in. Not that it mattered. Clark's attention was focused solely on Anabel. They talked about design philosophies, upcoming projects, and the future of architecture like they'd known each other for years. I stood there, feeling like an outsider in my own marriage, as they exchanged ideas with a chemistry that made my skin crawl. When we finally left the exhibition, Anabel was still buzzing with excitement, her phone lighting up every few minutes with new messages. She brushed it off as work-related, but I knew better. There was something about the way she clutched her phone that didn't sit right with me. "You seemed pretty taken with Clark back there," I said, half joking but testing the waters. She shrugged, her eyes still glued to her phone. "He's just incredible, you know? I mean, the way he thinks about design, it's next level." I nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, seems like you two hit it off." She didn't respond. Instead, she laughed at something on her screen and shoved her phone back into her purse. That laugh was like a knife to the gut. As we drove home, my mind raced. Something wasn't right, and I couldn't shake the feeling that tonight was just the beginning of something far more dangerous. The days that followed the exhibition were different. I tried to ignore it at first, convincing myself that I was imagining things, but the changes in Anabel were too glaring to overlook. She became distant, distracted. There were more late nights at work, more last-minute meetings, and she was always glued to her phone, smiling at messages she wouldn't share with me. One night, I caught her staring at her screen, her fingers tapping furiously. "Who's that?" I asked casually, leaning over to catch a glimpse. She quickly locked her phone and looked up, startled. "Oh, just work stuff. A client. You wouldn't be interested." I raised an eyebrow. "A client? At 11 o'clock at night?" She shifted uncomfortably. "You know how demanding these people can be. Sometimes I think they forget that designers have lives outside of work." Her explanation didn't sit well with me, but I let it go. At least, on the surface. Inside, though, my mind was racing. Anabel had always been passionate about her work. But this was different. She wasn't just focused on her career, she was hiding something, and deep down, I knew what it was. I just didn't want to admit it to myself yet. Over the next few weeks, her behavior grew more erratic. She started coming home later and later, claiming she had design deadlines or was stuck in meetings. Sometimes, she didn't come home until after midnight, her face flushed, her clothes slightly disheveled, and always with some flimsy excuse about a late client dinner or a meeting that ran over. I tried to confront her about it once, but she brushed me off. "Matt, you're overthinking this," she said, rolling her eyes as she pulled off her heels one night. "It's just work. You know how busy I've been with these new projects." "You've never been this busy before," I countered, crossing my arms. "And you're never this secretive." She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "It's just a stressful time, okay? Can't you trust me? You know how much I care about my career." I wanted to believe her. I really did. But the growing distance between us, the late nights, the constant texting, it all pointed to one thing. I just didn't have the courage to admit it yet. That's when I made the decision to check her phone. It wasn't something I wanted to do, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. One night, while she was in the shower, I grabbed her phone off the nightstand and unlocked it. My hands trembled as I scrolled through her messages, half hoping, half dreading what I might find. And there it was. A string of messages from Clark, the famous architect, the man she couldn't stop talking about. The texts were flirtatious, bordering on intimate. Plans for dinners, discussions about design that veered too far into personal territory, compliments that were far too familiar for someone who was supposed to be her colleague. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding in my chest. My worst fears were confirmed, and yet, I couldn't bring myself to look away. I stood there for what felt like hours, just staring at her phone, trying to make sense of it all. My mind replayed every recent interaction with Anabel, every suspicious glance, every late night. It all fell into place now, like pieces of a puzzle I didn't want to complete. The shower turned off, and I quickly put her phone back on the nightstand, my heart still racing. I heard her humming as she stepped out of the bathroom, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. "Hey, babe," she said, wrapping a towel around herself. "Do you want to grab dinner tomorrow? I've got some time free." I looked at her, barely able to contain the anger boiling inside. How could she stand there, smiling at me, pretending like everything was fine? "Sure," I said through clenched teeth. "Dinner sounds great." She smiled and leaned in to kiss me, but I pulled away, pretending to be distracted by something on the TV. She didn't seem to notice. Or maybe she did, but didn't care. Either way, I was done pretending. That night, I barely slept. My mind was consumed with thoughts of Clark and Anabel, of the lies she'd told me, and of the betrayal I'd just uncovered. By morning, my anger had turned into a cold, calculated resolve. I wasn't going to confront her, not yet. First, I needed a plan. And I knew exactly where to start. The following morning, I woke up feeling as though I was trapped in a nightmare. Everything seemed normal. Anabel was in the kitchen, sipping her coffee, scrolling through her phone like any other day. But now, I knew. I knew what she had been hiding, the secret she was keeping from me. And somehow, that made everything worse. I sat across from her at the kitchen table, watching her carefully, trying to see any signs of guilt or remorse. She was too calm, too casual, as if nothing was wrong. "Do you have plans tonight?" I asked, keeping my voice as steady as I could. Anabel glanced up at me, her expression unreadable. "I might have to meet a client, but I'll let you know if it runs late." There it was again, the same excuse she'd been using for weeks. But now I knew better. "Do you ever get tired of it?" I asked, my voice a little sharper than I intended. She frowned, her eyes narrowing. "Tired of what?" "Lying," I said, my gaze locked on hers. "Sneaking around, pretending everything's fine. Don't you ever get tired of pretending?" For a moment, she just stared at me, her face blank. Then, slowly, she set her coffee down and crossed her arms, a defensive posture I knew all too well. "Matt, what are you talking about?" I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. "I'm talking about Clark. I'm talking about the texts, the late nights, the excuses." "I know, Anabel. I know about the affair." Her face paled. For a brief second, I saw panic flicker in her eyes, but she quickly composed herself, shaking her head as if she could still deny it. "There's nothing going on with Clark," she said, her voice a little too calm. "We're just friends, Matt. Colleagues. Don't lie to me," I snapped, slamming my hand down on the table. "I saw the messages. I know what's been going on." She flinched at my outburst, but she didn't deny it this time. Instead, she looked away, her shoulders slumping as the weight of the truth settled over her. "How long?" I asked, my voice quieter now. "How long have you been seeing him?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stared at the floor, as if searching for the right words. Finally, she sighed, running a hand through her hair. "A few months," she admitted softly. "It wasn't supposed to be anything serious, Matt. It just happened." "It just happened?" I repeated, my voice dripping with disbelief. "You didn't accidentally fall into an affair, Anabel. You made a choice." She nodded, her eyes filling with tears. I know I did. And I'm sorry. I never meant to hurt you." "Sorry?" I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. "You're sorry? That's all you have to say?" You've been lying to me for months, and all you can say is that you're sorry? She wiped at her eyes, her voice trembling. I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't want to hurt you, Matt. I didn't want this to happen. Then why did you do it? I demanded. Why, Anabel? Was I not enough for you? Did our life together mean so little to you that you could just throw it all away? She looked up at me then, her eyes filled with pain. It wasn't about you, Matt. It was about me. I was lost. I needed something that made me feel alive again. And Clark gave you that, I said bitterly. He made you feel alive. She didn't deny it, and that hurt more than anything. After the confrontation, Anabel left the house, saying she needed time to think. I didn't stop her. In fact, I welcomed the silence after she was gone. It gave me time to plan, time to figure out my next move. I sat at the kitchen table for hours, staring at the spot where Anabel had been sitting just a few moments ago. The pain of her betrayal still throbbed in my chest, but now it was mixed with something else, anger. Cold, calculating anger. She thought she could get away with this. She thought she could lie to me, betray me, and then walk away as if nothing had happened. But she was wrong. She had underestimated me. I wasn't just going to let her off the hook. I wasn't going to confront Clark or beg her to come back. No, I had something much better in mind. If she thought Clark was her ticket to a better life, she was about to find out just how wrong she was. I grabbed my laptop and started doing some research. It wasn't hard to find out more about Clark Reed. He was well known in the design world, praised for his creativity and innovation. But he had a reputation to maintain, and that's where I saw my opening. I scrolled through articles, looking for anything that could help me. Clark's image was spotless, carefully curated. A man with a perfect career, admired by many. But all it would take was one scandal to bring him down. I started drafting an anonymous tip to one of the major design magazines. Something subtle, something that wouldn't immediately implicate me but would raise enough questions. I included just enough details about his affair with Anabel, about their secret meetings and the way he'd crossed professional boundaries. The media loved stories like this: drama, betrayal, the fall of a respected public figure. It wouldn't take long for the whispers to start, for Clark's carefully crafted image to begin unraveling. I didn't feel guilty about it. Clark had been reckless, and Anabel had been too blind to see that their affair wasn't just going to stay a secret forever. I was simply speeding up the inevitable. As I hit send on the email, a sense of satisfaction washed over me. This was only the beginning. It didn't take long for things to start unraveling. Within a week, rumors about Clark and his affair with a married woman began circulating in the design community. At first, it was just whispers, quiet gossip exchanged at industry events. But soon enough, the story reached the ears of the press, and once the media got involved, everything exploded. I watched it all unfold from a distance, careful not to show any signs that I was involved. Anabel had no idea what was happening. She was too busy trying to figure out her next move, torn between her loyalty to Clark and whatever was left of her feelings for me. One evening, she came home from work, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. "Have you seen the news?" she asked, her voice shaky. I looked up from the TV, feigning ignorance. "No, why? It's about Clark," she said, sinking down onto the couch beside me. "There's a story going around about him and a married woman. They're saying he's been having an affair, and it's ruining his reputation." I turned to face her, my expression carefully neutral. "That's awful. Do they know who the woman is?" She shook her head. "No, not yet. But if they find out, I don't know what I'm going to do." I could see the panic in her eyes, the realization that her affair was about to become public knowledge. She was terrified, not just for Clark, but for herself. If the story broke, it wouldn't just ruin his career, it would destroy hers too. I leaned back in my chair, watching her carefully. "Maybe it's time to think about what really matters, Anabel." She looked up at me, confused. "What do you mean?" I said slowly, "maybe it's time to figure out where your loyalties lie. Is Clark really worth losing everything for?" Her eyes filled with tears as the weight of my words sank in. She had thought she could have it all: Clark, her career, and me. But now, she was starting to realize that her choices had consequences. And I was the one making sure she felt every single one of them. The tension between Anabel and me had grown unbearable after the news broke about Clark's affair. She spent most of her days either locked in her studio or on frantic calls, trying to salvage her career without arousing suspicion. Meanwhile, I kept my distance, watching the destruction unfold, knowing it was only a matter of time before everything collapsed. One night, about a week after the scandal started making headlines, Anabel came home late again. This time, however, she didn't even bother with an excuse. Her face was flushed, her eyes red from what I assumed had been hours of crying. She slumped down at the dining table, burying her face in her hands. "I can't take it anymore," she muttered, her voice muffled by her hands. I sat across from her, feigning concern. "What happened?" She looked up at me, tears streaming down her face. "Clark's career is over. The board at his firm is forcing him to step down, and his sponsors are pulling out. Everything he's worked for, it's all gone because of me." I tilted my head slightly, pretending to think it over. Or maybe it's because of him. He's the one who decided to have an affair with a married woman. What did he think would happen? Anabel winced at the word, affair. I could tell she hated hearing it said out loud, as if naming it made it real, inescapable. She let out a shaky breath, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "People are starting to ask questions," she whispered. "It won't be long before they figure out I'm the woman in the story. And when they do..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. We both knew what would happen next. Her reputation would be dragged through the mud alongside Clark's, and everything she'd worked for, the respect she'd earned in the design world, her business, her future, would be at risk. "You should have thought of that before," I said coldly, not bothering to hide my bitterness. "You had a choice, Anabel. You chose him." "I didn't," she began, but I cut her off. "Yes, you did," I snapped, standing up from the table. "You chose him over me, over our marriage. You thought you could have it both ways, that you could keep lying to me and nothing would ever come of it. Well, now you're seeing the consequences of those choices." Her lower lip quivered as more tears fell, but I didn't care. I had no sympathy left for her. She had betrayed me, and now she was facing the fallout. "What am I supposed to do?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I stared at her, my heart hardened by the months of deceit. "Figure it out. Just like you figured out how to lie to me all this time." She flinched at my words, as if they'd physically struck her. For a moment, she just sat there, sobbing quietly. I could feel the last remnants of our marriage slipping away, but I didn't try to stop it. In fact, I welcomed it. Finally, she stood up, still shaking, and walked to the bedroom without another word. I listened to the sound of the door closing behind her, the soft click that felt like the end of something permanent. As I sat back down at the table, I realized that, in a way, I'd gotten what I wanted. She was suffering, and so was Clark. But now that I'd set the wheels in motion, I wasn't sure how much farther I wanted it to go. Over the next few days, Anabel became more withdrawn, hardly speaking to me unless she absolutely had to. She spent most of her time locked in her studio, trying to stay out of the public eye as the media frenzy around Clark continued to grow. Every headline, every news article about the affair chipped away at her confidence, and I could see the toll it was taking on her. One afternoon, I came home early from work to find her sitting on the living room couch, staring blankly at the television. She didn't even seem to notice when I walked in. Her face was pale, and she looked like she hadn't slept in days. "Anabel," I called out, but she didn't respond. I walked over to her, standing in front of the TV to block her view. "Anabel, are you even listening?" She blinked slowly, as if coming out of a trance. "What?" I sat down next to her, eyeing her carefully. "You can't keep going on like this. You need to figure out what you're going to do." She shook her head, her voice hollow. "There's nothing to do. It's over. Everything's ruined." I sighed, rubbing the back of my neck. Part of me wanted to tell her she deserved this, that she had brought it on herself. But another part of me, maybe a smaller part, still cared. At least enough to not want her completely destroyed. "I told you before," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "this doesn't have to be the end. You need to make a choice. Either salvage whatever's left of your career or keep hiding until they figure out you're the woman." She looked at me with tired eyes, her expression defeated. "What's the point? Even if I try to save my reputation, it won't matter. The truth is going to come out eventually. Then make sure you're the one who controls the narrative," I said firmly. "You don't want to be the one who lets them tell your story for you." She stared at me for a long moment, as if considering my words. Finally, she nodded, though I could see the fear still lingering in her eyes. "What do I do?" she whispered. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. "You come clean. You tell the press your side of the story before they have a chance to dig any deeper." If you act like you have nothing to hide, they'll lose interest. Her eyes widened in shock. You want me to go public? To admit to the affair? It's the only way, I said. If you keep running, they'll catch up eventually. This way, you get to control what happens next. She hesitated, clearly terrified at the prospect. But after a moment, she nodded again, though this time with a bit more resolve. Okay, she said softly. I'll do it. I'll tell them everything. It was a dangerous move, but it was the only one she had left. And part of me couldn't help but feel a grim sense of satisfaction as I watched her prepare for the inevitable fallout. She had made her bed, and now she would have to lie in it. The following morning, Anabel called one of the top design magazines, arranging an interview with one of their reporters. I stayed out of her way as she prepared, watching from the sidelines as she rehearsed what she was going to say. I could tell she was nervous, terrified, even, but I also knew this was her best chance to save what little was left of her reputation. The interview took place in our living room, with a reporter and a photographer from the magazine setting up their equipment while Anabel fidgeted nervously on the couch. I watched from the kitchen, staying out of sight but listening intently. The reporter, a woman in her early 30s, sat across from Anabel, her notebook open on her lap. Thank you for agreeing to speak with us, Anabel. I know this must be difficult for you. Anabel nodded, her voice shaky. It is, but I think it's time the truth comes out. The reporter smiled sympathetically. Why don't you start by telling us what happened? For a moment, I thought Anabel would freeze, that she wouldn't be able to go through with it. But then, she took a deep breath and began. It started a few months ago, she said quietly, her hands trembling in her lap. I met Clark Reed at a design exhibition, and we started talking. At first, it was just professional, but over time, it became more than that. The reporter nodded, scribbling notes in her pad. And when did you realize it had crossed the line? Anabel swallowed hard, her eyes darting to the floor. I think I knew all along. But I didn't want to admit it. I didn't want to believe that I was capable of betraying my husband like that. My chest tightened at her words, but I forced myself to stay silent. Why are you choosing to come forward now? The reporter asked, her tone gentle but probing. Because it's the right thing to do, Anabel said softly. I made a mistake, a terrible mistake. And I need to take responsibility for it. The reporter nodded again, her pen moving swiftly across the page. What do you hope to achieve by telling your side of the story? Anabel hesitated for a moment, then looked up, her eyes filled with a mixture of regret and determination. I hope that by being honest, I can start to make amends. Not just with the public, but with my husband. I clenched my fists at her words, the anger I had been trying to suppress bubbling to the surface again. She was trying to salvage her image, but no amount of public confession could erase the months of lies she had fed me. Still, I kept my distance, letting the interview unfold. After what felt like an eternity, the reporter wrapped up the interview, thanking Anabel for her honesty. As they packed up their equipment and left, Anabel stood frozen in the middle of the living room, her face pale and drained of emotion. I approached her slowly, unsure of what to say. Finally, I broke the silence. Do you think it worked? She shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know, but it's the only thing I could do. I nodded, though I wasn't convinced. We both knew the damage had already been done, and no amount of damage control could fix what had been broken between us. And as I stood there, watching the woman I had once loved slowly unravel, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of the end. The morning after Anabel's interview felt like the calm before the storm. Except, in our case, the storm had already passed, leaving nothing but devastation in its wake. She was quiet, almost too quiet, as if all the emotions she'd poured out during the interview had drained the life out of her. I watched her move about the house, her actions robotic. Her eyes glazed over. The magazine interview hadn't been published yet, but we both knew it was just a matter of time before her words hit the public eye. She had opened herself up to the world, confessed everything, and now she was bracing herself for the backlash. I sat at the kitchen table, sipping my coffee, pretending to read the news on my phone. The silence between us felt heavy, like it could snap at any moment. Anabel stood by the counter, staring out the window with a cup of tea she hadn't touched. Finally, I broke the quiet. Do you feel better? I asked, my voice sounding more bitter than I had intended. She turned to look at me, her expression hollow. I don't know. I think I just feel numb. I nodded, though I didn't truly understand. I didn't feel numb. I felt anger, disappointment, and frustration all rolled into one. But numb? No, I hadn't reached that point yet. I'm not sure what happens now, she continued, her voice soft. I've done what I thought I had to do, but. I took a deep breath, letting the weight of the question sink in. I hadn't allowed myself to think that far ahead. I had been so focused on making her face the consequences of her actions that I hadn't considered what would come next for us. If there even was a next. I don't know, Anabel, I said honestly. I really don't know. She nodded, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of my words had pushed her down even further. For a moment, I thought she might start crying again, but she didn't. She just stood there, looking lost. I think I'll go stay at a hotel for a while, she said suddenly, the words surprising both of us. Give you some space. I didn't argue. In fact, I welcomed the idea. Maybe some distance would help clear my head, give me the perspective I needed to figure out what I really wanted. Yeah, I said after a moment. Maybe that's a good idea. She nodded again, as if trying to convince herself that this was the right decision. Without another word, she turned and headed upstairs to pack a bag. I sat there, listening to the sound of her footsteps on the stairs, wondering if this was the beginning of the end. The next few days without Anabel were eerily quiet. The house, once filled with her presence, now felt empty, almost abandoned. I went through my usual routine, work, the gym, errands, but everything felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, even though I knew exactly what it was. At first, the silence was a relief. I didn't have to face her, didn't have to deal with the tension between us. But as the days went by, the quiet started to gnaw at me. I found myself missing the sounds of her movements around the house, the soft hum of her voice as she talked on the phone, even the way she would leave her shoes in the hallway, something that used to annoy me. I hated that I missed her. I hated that despite everything she had done, there was still a part of me that couldn't let go. It was infuriating. I had every reason to want her out of my life, to move on and start fresh. But something kept holding me back. Something I couldn't quite explain. One evening, I sat alone on the couch, a beer in hand, flipping through the channels on TV without really watching anything. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, and I glanced down to see Anabel's name on the screen. For a moment, I debated whether or not to answer. We hadn't spoken since she left, and I wasn't sure I was ready to hear whatever she had to say. But curiosity got the better of me, and I picked up the call. Hey, I said, my voice sounding more casual than I felt. Hi, she replied, her voice soft. I just wanted to check in. See how you're doing. I'm fine, I said, trying to keep the conversation short. There was a long pause on the other end, and I could hear her breathing, as if she was struggling to find the right words. I miss you, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't respond right away. I wasn't sure how to. Part of me wanted to say that I missed her too, that I wanted her to come home, that we could figure things out. But the other part of me, the part that was still hurt, still angry, refused to let those words come out. Instead, I just said, yeah. She waited for more, but when I didn't say anything else, she let out a small sigh. I know I hurt you, she said quietly. And I don't expect you to forgive me. But I want you to know that I'm sorry. For everything. I clenched my jaw, my fingers tightening around the beer bottle. Her apology felt empty to me, like it was too little, too late. I need time. Anabel, I said, my voice firm. I can't just forget everything that's happened. I know, she whispered. I just hope that, in time, we can at least talk. We'll see, I replied, not committing to anything. There was another pause, then she said, okay. Take care, Matt. You too. I hung up the phone, staring at the screen for a long time after the call ended. I didn't know what I wanted anymore. I didn't know if I could ever forgive her, or if I even wanted to try. All I knew was that nothing felt right anymore. 2 weeks had passed since Anabel moved out, and I had settled into a routine that felt somewhat normal. But one afternoon, as I was leaving the gym, something unexpected happened. I was heading towards my car when I saw a familiar face in the parking lot. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but as I got closer, I realized it really was him, Clark Reed. He was standing by his car, talking on the phone, oblivious to my presence. My blood boiled at the sight of him. This was the man who had not only destroyed my marriage but also ruined Anabel's life. I had thought I was done with this anger, but seeing him now brought it all rushing back. Without thinking, I marched over to him, my fists clenched at my sides. Clark noticed me approaching and ended his phone call, his face paling as he recognized me. "Matt," he said, his voice tense. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Yeah, well, I didn't expect to run into you either," I said coldly. "But here we are." He swallowed nervously, glancing around as if looking for an escape. "Look, I know you're angry. And you have every right to be, but you think you can just walk away from all of this?" I interrupted, my voice rising. "You think you can ruin people's lives and just keep going like nothing happened?" Clark held up his hands defensively. "I'm not trying to walk away from anything. I've lost just as much as you have, Matt." I let out a bitter laugh. You lost your career, sure, but I lost my marriage. You don't get to compare the two. I didn't mean for any of this to happen," he said, his voice pleading. It got out of control." "Yeah, well, it's too late for apologies now," I snapped, taking a step closer. "You made your choices, Clark. And now we're all dealing with the consequences." For a moment, I thought about hitting him, about letting out all the rage I had been holding in. But as I stood there, staring at the man who had caused so much pain, I realized something. It wasn't just Clark who had made those choices. Anabel had made them too. And so had I, in a way, by letting things get this far. I took a step back, my hands slowly unclenching. "Stay away from her," I said quietly. "If you have any respect left for anyone, stay out of our lives." Clark nodded, looking relieved that I wasn't about to hit him. "I will. I promise." Without another word, I turned and walked away, feeling a strange sense of closure, but also an emptiness I couldn't shake. As I drove home, I realized that while I had finally faced the man who had been at the center of all this chaos, it hadn't given me the satisfaction I thought it would. In fact, it had only reminded me of how lost I still felt. And how far I still had to go to find my way out of this mess. It had been nearly a month since I confronted Clark, and though I hadn't seen him again, the conversation played on a loop in my mind. Every day I woke up hoping things would get better, hoping the anger, the hurt, and the emptiness would fade. But no matter how hard I tried to move forward, I couldn't escape the weight of everything that had happened. Anabel had been staying at a hotel, and our communication was minimal. Just a few strained text messages checking in, mostly about logistical things like bills or the house. I still hadn't decided what to do. Part of me wanted to believe that there was a way to rebuild, to salvage something from the wreckage of our marriage. But the other part, the part that remembered her betrayal and all the lies, couldn't see how that was possible. One Saturday afternoon, I was sitting in the living room when I heard the sound of keys jingling at the front door. My heart skipped a beat as the door swung open and Anabel stepped inside. She was carrying a small bag, her expression a mix of hesitation and fear. "Hey," she said softly, setting the bag down by the door. I nodded but didn't get up from the couch. "Hey, I wanted to talk," she continued, wringing her hands nervously. "I thought maybe we could, I don't know, figure things out." I raised an eyebrow, not sure what she meant by figure things out. We had already had more conversations about her affair than I cared to count. And none of them had led to any real solutions. "What is there left to figure out, Anabel?" I asked, my voice tired. "You cheated, you lied, and now, here we are." "I know, but," she took a deep breath, her eyes pleading. "I love you, Matt. I know I messed up, and I know I hurt you, but I still love you. Doesn't that count for something?" Her words stung, and I felt a knot tighten in my chest. I didn't know how to respond. I wasn't even sure if I believed her anymore. "I don't know if love is enough," I said quietly. "I don't know if it can fix everything that's broken between us." Anabel took a step closer, her voice trembling. "I'm willing to do whatever it takes. Therapy, counseling, anything. I don't want to lose you, Matt. Please." I stood up from the couch, finally facing her. There was a part of me that wanted to give in, to believe that we could somehow work through this. But another part of me, one that had grown stronger over the past few weeks, knew the truth. "I don't think I can ever trust you again," I said, my voice steady but filled with finality. "And without trust, there's nothing left." Her eyes filled with tears, and she looked down at the floor, her shoulders slumping in defeat. I understand." I swallowed hard, feeling a lump in my throat as I watched her crumble. This was the woman I had once loved more than anything in the world, and now, I didn't even know her anymore. "I think it's time we both move on," I said, the words painful but necessary. "There's no going back from this." "Anabel." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I'm sorry, Matt. I really am. I know, I whispered. But sorry isn't enough. For a moment, we stood there in silence, the weight of the moment settling over us like a heavy fog. Finally, Annabelle wiped her eyes and picked up her bag, heading for the door. I'll be out of your life soon, she said softly, her voice breaking. I just need a little more time to figure things out. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I just watched her go, the door closing behind her with a soft click. And just like that, it was over. The next few days were a blur of paperwork and difficult conversations. Annabelle and I had agreed to start the process of filing for divorce, and though the decision had been mutual, it didn't make it any less painful. I spent hours going over documents, signing my name to the official end of our marriage, all while wondering how things had gone so wrong. I hadn't told anyone about our decision yet. Not my family, not my friends. I wasn't sure how to bring it up. It felt too personal, too raw. But I knew I couldn't avoid it forever. One evening, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my phone. I needed to call my parents, needed to tell them that their son's marriage had fallen apart. I knew they wouldn't judge me, but the thought of explaining everything made my stomach turn. Finally, I dialed the number, my heart pounding in my chest as I waited for my mom to answer. Hi, sweetheart. Her cheerful voice came through the speaker. How's everything going? I didn't want to go into all the details, didn't want to relive the mess of the past few months. But I owed her an explanation. She cheated on me, Mom, I said, my voice thick with emotion. It's been going on for a while, and I can't do it anymore. My mom let out a small gasp, and I could tell she was trying to hold back tears. I'm so sorry, Matt. I had no idea things were that bad. Neither did I admitted. But now, it's over. There was a long pause before she spoke again. I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself, for knowing what you deserve. But I know this isn't easy. It's not, I said quietly. But I think it's for the best. We talked for a while longer, my mom offering words of comfort and support. By the time I hung up, I felt a small sense of relief, like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. Telling her had been difficult but necessary. Now, I just had to figure out how to move forward. As the weeks went by, the reality of my new life began to sink in. Annabelle and I had officially filed for divorce, and though we still had to sort out the details, splitting our assets, deciding what to do with the house, I knew there was no turning back. I had started seeing a therapist, something I had never thought I would do, but I knew I needed help processing everything. The sessions were difficult at first, but slowly, I began to feel like I was making progress. I was learning to let go of the anger, the bitterness, and the pain that had consumed me for so long. One afternoon, after a particularly emotional session, I found myself sitting in a park, watching the world go by. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden glow over everything, and for the first time in months, I felt a small sense of peace. I pulled out my phone and opened the Photos app, scrolling through the pictures of Annabelle and me from happier times. Our wedding day, our first vacation together, the countless moments we had shared. There was a part of me that still mourned the loss of those memories, but I knew I couldn't hold on to them forever. I tapped on one of the photos, the one of us standing on the beach, smiling as the waves crashed behind us. Then, with a deep breath, I hit delete. The image disappeared from my screen. And with it, a chapter of my life came to an end. As I stood up to leave the park, I realized that I was ready to move on. Ready to start fresh, to build something new from the ashes of what had been. And though the road ahead was uncertain, I knew one thing for sure, I was going to be okay. For the first time in a long time, I believed it.